September 1945. Aboard this train leaving Germany is a painting sought by a woman. It is all that is left of her family. Where's my painting? What has become of it? When might I get it back? Attached is a photo, she writes to a friend. The cherished painting is a masterpiece by Auguste Renoir, and the little girl it depicts is the woman herself when she was 8. Her name is Irène Cahen d'Anvers. When Renoir painted her, she had no idea her portrait's fate would turn out to be as turbulent and tragic as her own. Never had a painting been as disregarded and unloved as the one that came to be known as Girl with a Blue Ribbon, or Little Irene. Even today, its exhibition creates a bit of a stir. Why? What happened to it? What did this painting witness? From its creation in 1880, the painting's history was fraught. It all began when Irene's father, a renowned banker named Count Louis Cahen d'Anvers, wanted a painting of his children.
In every upper-class family, it was customary to commission portraits by painters, not just of the parents, but the children as well, for posterity's sake. One of the Count's friends, Charles de Frucy, introduced him at a dinner party to a painter named Renoir, whose star was beginning to rise, but who was not yet what he would eventually become.
Count Cahen d'Anvers had reservations. Like many, he did not understand Impressionism, of which Renoir was one of the pioneers. The Count couldn't identify with her themes. What finally convinced him was the portrait Renoir painted of the wife and children of Georges Charpentier, another member of the upper class, like the Count himself. In the painting, dated 1878, Renoir moved away from Impressionism. The lines are clearer, yet mainly he managed to capture the perfect image of a glowing mother. The portrait, exhibited at the Salon de Paris, where art was made, garnered such appreciation that Camille Pissarro declared, "Renoir had such great success at the Salon, I think he's on his way. Good for him. Poverty's tough." Yet in 1880, Renoir was destitute, and despite his rising reputation, he sold very little. At the age of 39, he was struggling and found the path long. Luckily, Paul Durand-Ruel, Renoir's dealer, believed in him and was willing to help him out. "Dear Monsieur Durand-Ruel, as you are so kind as to handle my commissions, I would ask that you please pay 2 bills of 180 francs apiece." Durand-Ruel prompted Renoir to accept the offer. According to him, it could very well turn out to be more lucrative than the Charpentier commission. And so Renoir agreed to paint Irene. Although his friend Edgar Degas chided him for catering to the world of finance, Renoir would try to find some enjoyment in it. As he said, "I can't paint if I'm not having fun." Renoir was always experimenting and would make the portrait one of his most surprising works of art. Although the brushwork on the leaves in the background, the girl's dress, and the flowing hair reflect the Impressionist style, the precision of the face and its lines stands out. The contrast of styles highlights the model and creates the impression she's alive. What's striking is the girl's expression. Her gaze wavers between melancholy, sadness, and boredom. It is immediately moving. Did Renoir, the painter known for his joie de vivre, perceive and capture the melancholy of a child weighed down by the decorum of her social milieu? Or did he merely depict his own doubts? Did he not tell his son Jean, "When I paint a portrait, it is myself I paint"?
Renoir didn't like painting the portrait of Irène Cahen d'Anvers. When the Cahen d'Anvers received the portrait, they didn't like it either, to such an extent that they didn't display it on their walls, but hung it in the communal area of their Hôtel Particulier. When Renoir found out, he was very angry, humiliated even.
Too modern, the Cahen d'Anvers declared. Compared to the portrait of their son Robert, Renoir's painting was clearly out of place. Even Irene, at the tender age of 8, couldn't recognize herself in the portrait.
Renoir came to collect his fee, but they hadn't settled upon an amount, so it was extremely awkward. In the end, the family gave him 1,500 francs, which was a lot for Renoir, but still much less than what others gave their portrait painters, so it didn't go very well at all.
Renoir, offended that his painting was hung well out of sight and disappointed with the amount of money he was paid, fell prey to the basest kind of prejudice. As he wrote to a friend, "It is no surprise they're so stingy. The Cahen d'Anvers are Jewish."
Renoir was anti-Semitic, and he did not hide the fact. Did his anti-Semitism make their relations so poor, or did it result from their poor relations? We don't know.
It was a current that was gaining ground in those days. National sentiment had emerged since France's defeat by Prussia in 1870, provoking a wave of anti-Semitism. Among the long list of grievances, Jews were reproached for controlling the banks and world of finance. Never mind that the Lafittes, Mallets, and Mirabeaus also ran large banks. Only Jews were named. The Cahen d'Anvers suffered the same fate, and Renoir, in his own way, contributed to the falsehood. After 3 years tucked out of sight, Paul Durand-Ruel brought the portrait of little Irene out of hiding. In 1883, he convinced the Count Cahen d'Anvers to lend him the painting for a solo exhibition for Renoir, the first. Renoir's anger was quelled by the inclusion of the painting. Visitors were delighted by the work and nicknamed it "Girl with a Blue Ribbon," or more fondly, Little Irene. But once the show was over, the painting was forgotten once more, while in the meantime, Renoir's work slowly began to gain recognition. In 1886 in New York, dealer Paul Durand-Ruel managed to organize an exhibition of 300 Impressionist works by Monet, Pissarro, Degas, and 38 paintings by Renoir. Little Irene would not make the trip. Durand-Ruel was a missionary. Lucky for us, his religion was painting, Renoir said. At the time of this relative transatlantic success, Renoir himself had been exploring other artistic horizons for the past 5 years. I came to the realization that I could neither paint nor draw. In short, I had reached an impasse. Having exhausted Impressionism, Renoir set out in search of inspiration along the Mediterranean. Dear Mr. Durand-Ruel, I'm still plagued by the sickness of research. I erase and erase some more. I hope this obsession will cease. I think I will not bring much back from my trip, but I believe I will have progressed, which is always the case after much searching. During his travels, Renoir discovered the works of the great master Raphael. He was captivated, and in 1883 began to seek inspiration from them. His lines grew clearer, his shapes more defined, and his colors colder. Some art critics even claimed that the portrait of little Irene heralded this artistic development. Renoir called it his harsh style, while others spoke of an Angkor period. Renoir was still sharply criticized, but never mind, he followed his own path. Dear Durand-Ruel, if I was accused of neglecting my art or sacrificing my ideas for the sake of stupid ambition, then I would understand the critics. But as that is not the case, there's nothing to be said. On the contrary. In 1891, the real Irene was 19 when she married a man 12 years her senior. The painting went with her.
She was a woman with flair. Apparently, she had quite an allure, with a great deal of natural elegance. This was a woman people would turn to watch when she passed. The age difference was what it was. I suppose you could call it a marriage of convenience. There's evidence that he was happier about the marriage than his wife.
Moïse de Commando, her husband, was also a banker. His family, originally from the Ottoman Empire, had been in France for 20 years. The union provided the occasion for the Countess Louise Cahen d'Anvers to offer Renoir's portrait to her daughter, a way to get rid of it. Despite the years that had passed, Irene still wasn't fond of the portrait. What's more, Moïse de Commando, like most upper-class men, was a collector with a passion for the 18th century.
Moïse de Commando was a man who, from early on, would work to extricate himself from the realm of finance, management, and banking. He chose to focus on his collection. I would even venture to say he was focused on his integration into French society, because that was indeed the explicit goal, and his collection was part of his ticket in. Each piece is the best of what a collector had to have. It wasn't a matter of showing off or being ostentatious. Nothing's ostentatious here. There's no luxury in the strict sense of the word. But there is refinement and a combination of elements that creates an exceptional sense of harmony. And that's what he was looking for. The portrait would have stood out. It would have been a blotch of Impressionist color in a world entirely devoted to 18th century art.
And so the painting continued to be banished and scorned, a fate its model would oddly come to share. Irene had 2 children from her marriage, a son, Nassim, his father's pride and joy, and a daughter, Beatrice, who inherited her mother's character. But the happiness she derived from her children wasn't enough, and Irene grew bored in the marriage. For distraction, she turned to the paddocks and the stables, her passion.
Moïse was quite a somber, austere man. He'd lost an eye in a hunting accident. He was rather dull, and considering Irène Cahen d'Anvers's temperament and personality, animated, enthusiastic, cheerful, vivacious, and highly sociable. Well, as one can easily imagine, she had lovers.
In this milieu, even if one was allowed certain freedoms, which Irene's parents themselves partook of, it was customary to stay together for the sake of propriety.
But Irene would have none of that. She fell passionately in love with a man named Count Charles Sampieri, an Italian who was very handsome, a real charmer, and greatly appreciated by women, a man who was penniless.
Irene listened to her heart and left everything for Count Sampieri. She even dared to ask for a divorce, which was granted to her in 1902.
It created quite an uproar in their social circle, because in the early 20th century, people did not get divorced.
Whether rich or poor, Catholic or Jewish, it was simply unthinkable. Divorced people were social outcasts, even more so for women. But it didn't matter to Irene. She would live her passion to the hilt. Wednesday, March 4th, 1903. My dear children, I have some news for you that will certainly not surprise you. The other day, I married Mr. Sampieri. When you grow up, you'll understand better how I suffered from having no one to share my life with. Goodbye to you, my sweethearts. I hope to see you soon. I love you very, very much. Your mama.
She married him. Not only did she marry him, but she converted to Catholicism in order to marry him in the church. So it was a double blow to both her family and her social milieu.
Moïse de Commando, hurt and humiliated, sued for custody of the children. Irene was granted only limited visitation rights. Nassim and Beatrice would rarely see their half-sister, Claude Sampieri. Love came at a high price in the early 20th century. With Irene a social outcast, the portrait of her as a melancholy little girl grew unbearable to Moïse. Since she showed no interest in getting it back, he returned the painting to his parents-in-law, the Cahen d'Anvers. The portrait of the rebellious daughter was once again hung on a wall well out of sight. In a curious inverse movement opposing the painter and his portrait, Renoir's star was on the rise. His success stemmed from yet another evolution in his painting. Dear Mr. Duranjuel, to achieve the result I've been seeking and still seek, I've tried every process. No one could fault me for locking myself into a system. Though he did not return to his purely impressionistic style, Renoir softened the faces of his subjects while preserving the happiness and joy that illuminate his works. It was Renoir's pearly style and would be the start of his recognition. In 1892, the state purchased a work from this period, Young Girls at the Piano, for 4,000 francs. The painting was displayed in the Luxembourg Museum. From then on, Renoir, at the age of 51, saw his paintings increase in value. But his contentment was tarnished by a lurking ill, rheumatoid arthritis that would only get worse. To calm the outbreaks, he set up his easel in 1903 at Cannes-sur-Mer. In this wonderful land, he said, it seems one cannot be touched by misfortune. As always, Renoir painted incessantly one of his favorite subjects, women. Woman in all her glory and sensuality. As Mirabeau wrote, Renoir accentuated women in every social setting, in every light. Just as Watteau created the elegance of the 18th century woman, Renoir created the elegance of the 19th century woman. In those years, Renoir would gradually change his color palette.
S'étant aperçu que des toiles de lui faites 30 ans auparavant avaient un peu perdu de leur éclat, il employait depuis quelques années les tons les plus vifs de sa palette, et si on lui en demandait la raison, il disait « Je travaille à présent pour l'avenir, et les toiles que je fais aujourd'hui seront bien dans 20 ans. »
In 1912, during an exhibition at the Galerie du Rond-Ruel, Renoir's dealer observed that several visitors who until now did not understand Mr. Renoir's talent are finally beginning to appreciate him. Renoir was over 65, and at long last, he existed. But the painter's renown did not spell the end of little Irene's banishment. Neither Irene nor her parents would change their minds about the painting. In fact, did they even remember it? They had enough to worry about with everything happening on the world stage. In 1914, World War I broke out. Irene was proud, but anxious to see her 22-year-old son, Nissim, join the Air Force.
Naturally, Nissim was delighted to enlist, and his father too. Why? Because not doing so was unthinkable. Let's not forget how their family had never stopped yearning to buy their way into French society.
Nissim quickly became a graded pilot known for his composure and skill. But on September 5th, 1917, during an air battle, his plane was hit by enemy fire and crashed in Lorraine, in the east of France. The tragedy did not bring his parents together. When a service to honor Nissim was held at the Grand Synagogue in October 1917, Moïse did not allow Irene to attend.
From that point on, Moïse de Camondo fell into a period of great sadness. He was on his own, all alone, walled up in his solitude, in his sadness, his grief. I think these walls still bear the mark of that solitude and endless sorrow.
Voici Auguste Renoir. Il est très malade. Le rhumatisme a déformé ses pauvres mains et bien qu'il souffre perpétuellement, il travaille sans cesse. Et il continuait de peindre malgré tout. Et sa vision des choses était telle qu'elle était quand il avait 20 ans. Il n'avait aucune mélancolie et sans tristesse, il voyait chaque année refleurir les anémones qui n'avaient pas de secret pour lui.
Recognition for a life devoted to painting finally came when one of his works was displayed at the Louvre in 1919. Renoir was one of the rare artists to enjoy such a privilege in his lifetime. I think I really deserve a bit of success, as I've worked hard. He died a few months later, on December 3rd, 1919, in Cannes-sur-Mer. On his deathbed, he requested canvas and brushes to paint the bouquet of flowers on his windowsill. When he finished, he told the nurse, "I think I'm starting to understand." He left the world over 4,000 works of art, each one reflecting his free and joyful artistic approach. The year Renoir died, little Irene moved houses. Louise Cahen d'Anvers, probably tired of seeing it in the hallways of her home, offered the painting to her granddaughter, Béatrice de Commando, who'd recently got married. Béatrice, who'd been separated from her mother as a child, transferred her thwarted daughterly affection onto the painting. She loved the portrait and proudly displayed it in her home in Neuilly, where she lived with her husband, Léon Reynac, and her children, Fanny and Bertrand. Irene, as uncompromising and passionate as ever, had separated from Count Sampieri and now lived alone. Moïse continued to sink into sadness, buying more and more artworks as a means of consolation. News that a virtually unknown Renoir hung in the Reinac's home aroused the curiosity of art dealers who lost no time in contacting them. Béatrice only consented to lend the portrait for 2 exhibitions honoring Renoir. One at the Orangerie in 1933, and the other at the Bernheim Jeune Gallery in 1938. After 50 years of being shunned, the work finally found the pride of place it deserved. The face of the young girl whose sky has not yet been stolen, a musical face which an inner light composes more than her traits, and whose Madonna face will be the happy completion, penned the poet Henri Michaud. But this brief moment of glory came to a halt with the start of World War II. On September 3rd, 1939, France declared war on Nazi Germany. The conflict once more plunged the country and the portrait of little Irene into a period of upheaval. Intuitively, the director of France's national museums, Jacques Jaujard, quickly decided to protect the Louvre's public collections. He had them moved to the Château de Chambord, where they would be safe from bombs and covetous Nazi eyes.
As soon as France declared war on Germany, Léon Reynac knew deep down that his art collection was in danger. He was familiar with the national museums, and so he went to Jacques Jaujard and asked him to take some of his collection along in the crates that were headed for shelter at Chambord.
Leon Reinach was right to be worried. When it came to art, Hitler had a plan on par with his delusions of grandeur.
Hitler wanted to create the largest European museum in the city of Linz. He needed artworks to fill its walls, and to find them, he had the enormous playground of occupied Europe. Quite quickly, under the authority of the head ideologue of the Third Reich, Alfred Rosenberg, a task force would be established called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, otherwise known as the ERR, dedicated to plundering and appropriating artworks that belonged mainly to Jewish families.
In the 4 years leading up to the war, the task force methodically compiled a list of all the private collections they planned to acquire. That of Leon Reinach, affiliated with the Commando family, appeared on the list. From the very first days of the German occupation, the ERR traced the various collections and found Reinach's at the Château de Chambord on July 7, 1941, among the national collections stored there.
And then they simply took their pick, confiscating the crates belonging to various Jewish families, including Leon Reinach's. And we know for sure that the portrait of Irène Cahen d'Anvers was among those taken. It reached the Jeu de Paume Museum. We don't have the exact date, but we do have a fairly accurate idea thanks to Rose Vallon, temporary custodian at the Jeu de Paume, who for 4 years kept a list of the artworks she saw come through the museum and the names of their collectors. The information was extremely precious in the days immediately following the war, when it came time to find the artworks.
When Leon Reinach learned his collection had been plundered, he pleaded his case directly to the Vichy regime, to no avail. As for Beatrice, she refused to recognize the danger Jews faced.
She figured that since she was part Commando and part Cahen d'Anvers, two important families, Jewish families to be sure, but also important Parisian families, she figured she was somehow protected, even more so as the sister of a man who died in battle for France. She considered herself safe.
Her father Moïse, as a sign of his affection for France, even bequeathed upon his death in 1935 his collection and mansion on Rue Monceau to the Museum of Decorative Arts.
Beatrice continued to ride her horse daily through the Bois de Boulogne. At one point, the yellow star became mandatory. Apparently, she wore it on her riding habit. German officers would ride in the same club every day. She'd see them, but it wouldn't bother her.
Meanwhile, the painting of her mother was stored among other plundered works of art in a room at the Jeu de Paume called the Martyrs' Room. Here, little Irene would witness one of the most consequential traffics in the history of art.
Between 1940 and 1944, the art market experienced an economic boom. This is extremely cynical because let's not forget the historical backdrop where hundreds of thousands of Jews were being deported. What caused the economic boom? First of all, a lot of artworks were appearing on the market. There was a lot of merchandise. There was a lot of money because the Reichsmark was very high compared to the depreciated French franc. So the money was flowing.
With devaluation, the works cost very little. Unscrupulous art dealers flocked to Paris to buy paintings at low cost, or simply help themselves from the stocks. One of the main figures in this traffic was Bruno Lose, an active member of the ERR. Appointed as an advisor to Göring, he would organize exhibitions at the Jeu de Paume, where the field marshal would shamelessly select whatever he pleased, making sure, of course, to leave the choicest pieces for Hitler. In all this organized looting, what became of little Irene?
Hitler hated the Impressionists, plain and simple. So there was little market for Impressionist works in Germany. Nevertheless, German art dealers would come to the Paris market. They were aware of the intrinsic value of the works and knew it was possible to sell the works on neutral art markets, such as the Swiss market, where the work, if such were the case, would find a buyer.
If the painting did journey through Switzerland, was it displayed in the gallery of Theodor Fischer, a dealer known to have moved countless looted works?
The problem was that the collections got all mixed up in the Jeu de Paume. So afterwards, it was hard to find it and track it down.
The portrait of Irene had in fact been attributed to a different owner, Maurice de Rothschild. Other documents had mistakenly recorded its dimensions or date of creation. All the misinformation made it hard to trace. Meanwhile, the real Irene was being hidden by her former son-in-law, her daughter Claude's ex-husband, André de Bonnet, in his Chateau de Montgermont on the outskirts of Paris, which didn't stop de Bonnet from being on good terms with Hermann Göring, even enjoying an occasional meal together where they'd share stories of their days as fighter pilots in World War I. Irony of fate. And by following the trace of Maurice de Rothschild's collection, we discovered that little Irene was used as a bartering tool by Göring. On March 10, 1942, with Bruno Lose as middleman, Göring traded the portrait along with 3 other paintings for a work by Guillermo del Pacchia, Madonna with Child and Saints. The new owner of Renoir's painting was Gustav Rochlitz, one of the key profiteers in the war. What did he do with little Irene? Did he send her to Germany along with other pillaged works? That same year, 1942, Beatrice refused to hide, believing herself protected by the family's prestige. Nevertheless, she was arrested by French police, along with her daughter Fanny, and interned at Drancy. Not long after, they were joined by Léon and Bertrand. The entire family was deported to Auschwitz.
The father and children died rather quickly, according to sources. The mother a little later. The dates aren't important. What matters is that the Commando lineage died out in Auschwitz. Thus we can say, the Commando son died for France. The Commando daughter and her own children died because of France. Still today, when we visit the Nissim de Commando Museum, we don't feel like we're in a museum where everything's dead. It's alive. We're in a house, in somebody's home. We feel as if people still lived there, that we've broken in and they're going to return, that they've simply stepped out for a moment.
Dear Minister of Fine Arts, Allied troops have reached Fusen, and it is my honor to inform you that my brother, drafted against his will, like so many others, was traveling with the anti-Nazi priest, who told him the Germans had transported masterpieces from Versailles to the castle in Fusen. At the end of the war, as the monument's men advanced through Bavaria, they discovered over 500 repositories of artworks that had been looted by the ERR. Gustav Rauschlitz had hidden part of his loot in different spots, notably around Lake Constance, as well as Fusen, in the cellar of his home, and in an outbuilding of Hohenschwangau Castle, where Ludwig II of Bavaria spent part of his childhood. That is where the monuments men discovered the portrait of little Irene. On September 4th, 1945, the painting was taken to a collecting point in Munich, a place where looted works were gathered. At last, she came out of the shadows.
There was a photographer who took pictures of all of the works that came through the collecting point, which were then cross-referenced with the information collected by art historians, particularly Rose Vallon. Once all the works were identified, they could determine who the artworks needed to go back to. Initially, they were returned country by country.
The real Irene survived the war, but at what price? She would remember the portrait from her childhood. September 1945, my dear friend. Here are the 4 copies you asked for, and photos of the painting. I hope you managed to retrieve this charming keepsake from my youth. Sincerely yours, wrote Irene Sampieri to Albert Honreau, President of the Commission for Art Recovery.
Les services de récupération des armées alliées ont retrouvé en Allemagne les œuvres d'art volées. Ainsi, plusieurs milliers de pièces rares sont rentrées en France et sont exposées au musée de l'Orangerie. L'enfant aux bulles de savon de Chardin, de Fragonard, l'instant désiré. Un magnifique Franz Hals, la femme à la rose. Et voici du moderne, représenté par Renoir.
The goal of the 1946 exhibition at the Orangerie des Tuileries, the twin of the Jeux de Paume Museum, so there's a bit of nose-thumbing, was to present the masterpieces, the most important works that were found and recovered, both by members of the Commission for Art Recovery and the Allies.
October 1946. My dear friend, I phoned you several times in September to no avail. Where's my painting? What has become of it? When might I get it back?
The work was well documented in different exhibition catalogs, so it wasn't hard to confirm it belonged to her family. Yet it's surprising to see how much time passed between when the work was returned to Countess Sampieri on November 4th, 1946, and the date she asked for it, November 21st, 1945.
Difficulties stem from the fact that the organizers of the exhibition did not record the name of the owners of the artworks. And to confuse matters even more, Renoir's painting didn't belong to Irene, but to her daughter, Béatrice. Only when it was acknowledged that her daughter and grandchildren had perished in the camps did Irene once more become the rightful heir to the painting. 66 years later, it seemed as complex as ever to unite the portrait of little Irene with its real-life model.
The exhibition was a resounding success and was even extended. It was supposed to end in August, but instead ran until November 3, 1946. The very next day, Countess Sampieri signed the release that would allow her to recover the artwork, the portrait of her youth.
At 74, Irene found herself face to face with her 8-year-old self. But in 1949, with no reason given, she chose once more to part ways with the painting. Instead of donating her portrait to a national museum, as Moïse de Commando would have done, Irene decided to sell it. Why give such a gift to a country that turned its back on her family?
Today, we know that the person who initiated the sale was the banker of Countess Irène Sampieri-Camondo, depicted in the portrait known as Girl with Blue Ribbon by Auguste Renoir.
After its forced exile in Germany, the painting once more left France, making its way into the hands of Georges-Émile Burlet, a Swiss collector with infallible taste, but a controversial past.
Mr. Burlet was a man whose life was deeply marked by the 2 world wars in the 20th century. He survived World War I as a soldier in the German army because he was born in Germany. Later, he moved to Switzerland and made a name for himself as an arms manufacturer. So World War II was also a decisive moment in his life.
Indeed, after supplying weapons to the French and British armies, he became one of the suppliers of the Wehrmacht during the war. Burlet grew quite wealthy through his activities as an arms dealer. He was able to buy artworks on the Swiss market, notably from the gallery of the polemic dealer Theodore Fischer.
As soon as the war was over, it came out that among the nearly 100 artworks he'd purchased during the war, 13 were works that had been plundered. Émile Burlet was among the buyers of these works, which he immediately returned after the federal court in Lausanne decided they must be given back.
Even if there was nothing amiss about the acquisition of little Irene, it was now linked to a man with a contentious past. Even today, the name Émile Burlet fuels controversy. As for Irene the model, the painting's nickname finally caught up with her, uniting their fates forever. After having been unloved, hidden, and plundered, little Irene finally achieved the status of masterpiece.
Yes, that's the problem. It mustn't be cramped. Let's try a little more, just to be sure. We have to try as hard as we can. It needs to be centered. That's right. Yes. Perfect.
As Renoir said, I like painting best when it looks eternal without boasting about it. An everyday eternity.